All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. As you can see, I have a lot of books behind me. They're there every episode. And I figured, why not go through a couple today that have really shaped my political views. I did this episode a while back. I did a first version of this episode a couple months ago, and I really enjoyed making it, so I figured, why not do another one? I've been meaning to for a while. The kind of overall theme of this collection of books that I have next to me that we'll go over in this episode is, I guess, right-wing. That's a very broad way of putting it, but these are my right-wing book recommendations for anyone looking for maybe a couple it spans here from entry level to maybe some more advanced books on right-wing thought from a bunch of people who've really inspired the way I look at the world. So we'll talk about all this today and more on the Quest for Clarity podcast.
It is about who we are. It is about what we believe.
They're building up this case just like we did in Iraq. Build up the war propaganda. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq.
The more you tell the truth, the stronger you become.
Mr. Speaker, we're not rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic tonight. We're putting coal in the boiler and setting a course for the iceberg.
Maybe we should improve the liberty of our own country before we seek to do so abroad. Some of us have paid attention to the fact that the expert class, including the foreign policy experts, lie all the time. The correct answer to this, of course, as it always is liberty. All right, everybody, before we begin, if you wouldn't mind going right down below this video and hitting like and subscribe, I'd really appreciate that. Also, if you wouldn't mind going to my Instagram, X, and Spotify accounts and giving all of those a follow, I'd really appreciate that as well. Now, the first book we're going to get into here, we'll get into this in a second, is one of the what I would probably classify as a beginner entry-level book about libertarianism as a whole from the right-wing perspective. And I do want to revisit real quick because I think it's too good of a book to not revisit. One of the ones I recommended months ago in one of my prior recommendation videos, I want to revisit Anatomy of the State by Murray Rothbard because it is, if you read this, you will probably find it to be one of the most important things you've ever read in your entire life because it absolutely shatters the entire concept that you have in your mind right now of what the state is, what the government is. And just to revisit this real quick, because I think it's a very good pairing, actually, with the book I'm about to introduce for my actual first selection of things to read. These are the entry-level first things I would recommend to you to read if you're interested in right-wing libertarianism as a philosophy, as a thought, as political thought. What Rothbard does in this book is describe and break down how obviously the state is not us. This kind of democratic propaganda that we've been fed throughout all of our lives is that the people in the government, the representatives that we elect into Congress, the president, they are us, and they are acting in our best interests and really are acting on behalf of us. They are an entity that are, we are attached to them in kind of this philosophical sense. They are us. We, the people, are the government. And Rothbard just breaks down how that's obviously not the case. And he uses a very blunt example of this, which is if the people and the government were the same thing, then would the Jews who got killed by the Nazis in Germany during the Holocaust have been the government? Did they kill themselves? Obviously, that makes no sense. They didn't do that to themselves. There was another entity acting upon them, aggressing upon them illegitimately called the state. In that case, it was the Nazis. And that is the actual dynamic between the people and the state. There actually is this kind of never-ending tension and conflict between the people and the state, and we can see this in America today. When you get taxed, are you stealing your own money? Are the American people stealing their own money from the American people? That makes no sense. Obviously, there is another force, which is the state, which is separate from the American people, that is enforcing their will onto the American people. And the argument from Rothbard is that is an inherently illegitimate force. It is inherently illegitimate for them to be aggressing on the American people in this way. So just to revisit that is what Rothbard argues in Anatomy of the State. Highly recommend that. And it's actually a very good segue into the first real recommendation from this episode, which is The Revolution, a Manifesto by Ron Paul. You'll remember last time we did a book recommendations video, I recommended End the Fed by Ron Paul. And I kind of want to restate my recommendation here a little bit. I would actually recommend you read this first before End the Fed, just because End the Fed gets it's a little bit more specifically about the Federal Reserve, and it's kind of more technical. But I think if you read A Revolution paired with Anatomy of the State as the first two things you read about right-wing libertarianism and where the Rothbard, Ron Paul kind of mindset is coming from, it'll help you get a better understanding of kind of the basics. And what Ron Paul does in this book, The Revolution, is he goes through a bunch of really some of the major issues, and this book came out in the mid-2000s, the major issues of the time, and he really, if you read it today, he predicts so much of what would end up happening over the next 20 years since this book got released. He talks about how we have strayed away from the initial goals of the Founding Fathers and the Constitution, and we've deprioritized things like individual liberty, foreign policy restraint. We've devalued our currency, which is a theme you hear me constantly talking about here on the show, through endless wars, through the mass surveillance state, through the growth of government over the past 100 years, really since the Progressive era, through this massive expansion of the state. We've seen the currency devalued since we went off the gold standard under Richard Nixon. We've seen the currency devalued, and we've seen a massive expansion of the state, which then in turn infringes on all of our liberties, which were the cornerstone and the motivating factor behind the founders' writing of the Constitution. So he basically breaks down all of these major issues and shows how we've strayed so far from the Constitution over the years. And he's urging, this is a manifesto, so he's urging us to take a track back to the Constitution. He's giving us a positive message forward, which I will say, a little critique of a lot of libertarians I hear is that they don't present a positive message forward at all. This book is a positive message forward of what Ron Paul believes is the way back to the constitutional values that our country was founded on. And I do want to read a quick quote here from Ron Paul. This is chapter 1. The chapter is called The False Choices of American Politics, where he just breaks down the theater of American politics. Now, it's so ridiculous. This kind of game of Republican versus Democrat is really fake in a lot of ways. He says, quote, "Every election season, America is presented with a series of false choices. Should we launch preemptive wars against this country or that one? Should every American neighborhood live under this social policy or that one? Should a third of our income be taken away by an income tax or a national sales tax? The shared assumptions behind these questions, on the other hand, are never cast in doubt or even raised. And anyone who wants to ask different questions, or who even suggests that the questions are framed exclude attractive, humane alternatives, is ipso facto excluded from mainstream discussion." So and if you watch any old Ron Paul debate clips from his campaigns in both 2008 and 2012, Ron Paul was always the outsider on the Republican debate stage because he was the only one in both of those elections who was at all advocating for foreign policy restraint, because he was the wisest person on that stage by far. Compared to him, all the rest of the people on that stage were like complete idiots. And he correctly predicted how from the Iraq War all the way on through Syria, and he was advocating against a war with Iran even back in those times, because he perfectly predicted how this would end up. It's a growth of the state which infringes on our liberties, devalues our currency, and really degrades the country here at home. And nobody was a better champion of the ideas of liberty than Ron Paul. So I'd highly recommend The Revolution, a Manifesto by Ron Paul. Now, the next book I want to recommend to everybody is A Republic, Not an Empire by Patrick Buchanan. Obviously, this is a library copy, but I'll put the cover up on the screen just so everyone can know what to look for if you're looking for this online at all. Pat Buchanan, for those who may not know, he still is alive. He's retired, though. He's getting up there in age. Pat Buchanan was very prominent in the 90s and 2000s, a paleoconservative thinker, writer, commentator. He ran for president in the 90s and in 2000. He is an absolute hero. I hold him in incredibly high regard for so much of the stuff. I have a bunch of his books back there. All of them I would highly recommend. I recommended his other one, Where the Right Went Wrong, which we have a book later on, which covers a very similar theme of the history of the right wing in America and how there was a hostile takeover of the right wing in the late half of the 20th century, which nobody really knows about, but is very important to understanding the right wing today. Anyways, Pat Buchanan, very prominent paleocon thinker, meaning he was very against foreign interventions and he was very against mass migration. And he was also very traditionally conservative and was trying to preserve a lot of what the old right was about, which is traditional conservatism. And that was lost in the rise of the neoconservatives, which basically took over the right wing and took over the Republican Party late in the 20th century and culminating in the George W. Bush administration with the Iraq War. Anyways, back to the book itself, though. A Republic, Not an Empire is basically Pat Buchanan's entire history of American foreign policy spanning from the founding to World War II. And it's just, Pat, like when I say he's an incredible writer, he is just one of the best writers you will ever read. It's unbelievable. He has like a photographic memory. It's crazy the detail he goes into when describing literally like the battles of how America acquired Florida, like everything. His memory, his historic detail is incredible. And he goes into how the history of American foreign policy from the founding and how the founders were inspired and how they thought about American foreign policy and what they wanted it to be shaped by was actually non-interventionism. And the whole book is basically combating a lot of what has come to fruition in the 25 years since he wrote this book. And in the beginning of this book, I really highly recommend everyone read this. In the beginning of this book, he is prophetic in what he predicts will happen over the next 20 years. I believe that's the timeline he uses. From when he's writing this book, he talks about how NATO's encroachment against Russia will inevitably lead to a conflict with Russia. This is in 1999 he wrote this book. And he, obviously, as we've seen with the war over the past 4 years in Ukraine, he was spot on. Because if you know anything about the reasons for the war in Ukraine, you know it's not the propaganda they've told you. It's because the United States was about to add Ukraine to NATO, and that provoked the response from Russia. It doesn't justify it. It doesn't justify Putin's response. He's launched a violent war against Ukraine, and that's wrong. But it has some backstory here to endless NATO expansion up against Russia's borders. Pat Buchanan completely predicts that in this book, and it's just incredible. And I believe I actually have a quote here. I marked some quotes I wanted to read about this, which are just incredible. This is him predicting this. NATO expansionists, it says, quote, NATO expansionists have won the day, but they have scheduled a series of clashes that will mean a humiliating back down by either Russia or the United States, or war. We have committed American children yet unborn to fight Russians yet unborn over land no president ever considered vital. This hubristic attempt to impose a U.S. protectorate over Europe will one day be challenged. That day we will awaken to find that a new generation is not willing to send its sons to fight in places that they've never heard of, simply because this generation pledged they would go. NATO expansion is a rash and provocative act, unrelated to our true security interests and rooted in an ignorance of American history and tradition. Just like and you see it there, the writing is just incredible. And his prediction is just incredible. It came completely true. Yes, so for anyone looking to learn the actual true history of American foreign policy and how it does really have a non-interventionist bend to it, all the way from the founding, all the way up until that was kind of destroyed with Woodrow Wilson in World War I, and then how it degraded ever since then, this book is absolutely essential for anyone looking for a true history of American foreign policy. So highly recommend A Republic, Not an Empire by Pat Buchanan. Now, the next book I want to talk about here is Domestic Imperialism by Keith Knight. This is Keith Knight. He's the, I believe, managing director of the Libertarian Institute. Incredible resource for a lot of great books. They publish Scott Horton's books behind me, another great foreign policy mind. Scott Horton, his books on Russia, Ukraine, and the Middle East are, again, essential reading for having a true understanding of the history, as well as they also released Tom Wood's book on the COVID pandemic and all the lies that were told throughout that. So Libertarian Institute, huge shout out. It's been a great resource for me in just learning a lot. They have a lot of great books that are not actually that. They have a lot of free PDFs on their website. Just a great resource. This is Keith Knight from the Libertarian Institute, Domestic Imperialism, 9 Reasons I Left Progressivism. And in this book, he just goes through literally 9 reasons why he, a former progressive, left progressivism and realized all the incredible hypocrisy and double standards that are prevalent in progressive ideology. And I just want to read one of them here. A lot of it focuses on economics and and the economic hypocrisy of socialism, communism, just kind of progressivism as a whole. And as you can see, he's kind of debunking the ideas that were founded by people like FDR with the New Deal, Woodrow Wilson with wars, and Bernie Sanders, obviously, over the past like 20, 30 years of him in Congress and in the Senate. Here is just a quote from Keith Knight. This is from chapter 2, titled The Unavoidable Contradiction. It says, quote, "Progressives' central criticism of the free market is that such a system would lead to monopolies, where one person or group dominates an industry, resulting in higher prices and lower quality than what would otherwise exist in a more competitive situation. The progressive then advocates that the government monopolize taxation, business licensing, the justice system, guns, police, military, compulsory schooling, and the money supply. Consider the blatant double standard when it comes to the word contract, which usually implies that I will do X for you in exchange for Y. When you don't pay taxes, you are denounced for supposedly not upholding your end of the social contract, and this justifies putting you in jail. However, if the state doesn't uphold their end of the social contract and fails to keep you safe, do politicians go to jail? Do they no longer have a legal obligation to obey arbitrary legislation or pay taxes?" So, obviously, these are inherent double standards that really question the legitimacy of the state. This is something similar to what Rothbard discusses all throughout a lot of his literature. The contradiction here is that we have such standards for the free market and for voluntary interaction, and this is really the case for why being a socialist is to be inherently contradictory. Yet, when the government doesn't uphold their end of the bargain, when justice is not fulfilled in the court system, when the roads are not paved that you're forced to pay into, when a child comes out of the school system not having been educated, when in a voluntary system, you would be able to recognize these poor performances by these organizations and opt out of them and look for better alternatives that are going to give you more value for your money. With the government, though, this is a contradiction. You're not allowed to opt out of this, and the socialist actually advocates for more funding instead of less, which usually, if an organization was performing so poorly, then customers would leave and go to competitors, and that would incentivize that first organization to either improve their standards and improve their product or service, or that the free market would lead to them going down, and the competitors who perform that same task better and for a better value for the customer would be bolstered and would see more success. Except in the government system, there is no incentive for them to improve their services because you're forced to pay in regardless. So that is the contradiction that progressives and socialists it's unavoidable because they are advocating simultaneously against a monopoly, which is true. You shouldn't have a monopoly. Results in bad incentive structures. It reduces the incentives for improvement in the product. Yet they are perfectly okay with the government monopolizing all of these other incredibly important services and not having an incentive to improve on them. So this is the contradiction that Keith Knight perfectly lays out in his book Domestic Imperialism: 9 Reasons I Left Progressivism. Highly recommend. It's really short. You'll get through it. I got through it in just an afternoon, so you'll get through it just fine. It's really short, and it is full of so much incredible arguments when you're in a discussion or debate with your progressive friends. So just a great recommendation. And the last one I want to recommend to you today is another Murray Rothbard book called The Betrayal of the American Right. This is just incredible. This is the history of, as I discussed earlier with Pat Buchanan, there's been always throughout history, even today, you see this today with modern figures on the right wing, there has been this nonstop tension, really since after the world wars, between, you can kind of describe it as the paleocons and the neocons. That's kind of the modern iteration. That's even a little bit outdated, but it started back in the 50s and 60s with the rise of National Review and William F. Buckley. Now, the main divide between what was the old right and the neocons, and then what would go on to become the paleocons and the neocons, and then now we see it playing out today, is foreign policy. And this is where the old right and the new right, and by new right I mean neocons, not today, but this is where they divided, because the neocons, they firmly, and this was led by people like William F. Buckley, who wasn't himself a neocon, but he shared a lot of their same ideology. the neocons were very pro-war. They were the original Cold Warriors who were very hostile towards Russia during the Cold War, and they would then go on to advocate for the Persian Gulf War under George H.W. Bush, and they would go against, in that war, that was kind of one of the big battles of the paleocons versus the neocons. They would go against people like Pat Buchanan, who was very much a paleocon and very much against that war. And this would be a long line of figures who, like Murray Rothbard, like Ron Paul, like Pat Buchanan, would go on to make a lot of their career combating the rise of the neocons and the prominence of them in our foreign policy establishment. And they're driving us into expanding NATO, which would result in the war with Russia in 2022. They were constantly looking to provoke wars in the Middle East on behalf of Israel in a lot of cases. This was the battle that's been occupying conservatism for a long time. It is mostly over foreign policy. There are other side issues as well. Like people like Pat Buchanan were very much more restrictionist on immigration than someone like William F. Buckley. There was also the issue of the traditional conservatism as well, and conservative values. There is a feeling, I think very validly justified, that people like William F. Buckley really did not conserve a lot of what was traditional America. People like Pat Buchanan would argue that, and I think that's largely correct. A lot of traditional values were lost over the period where Buckley was the prominent right-winger. Now, that is the Betrayal of the American Right. That was Murray Rothbard. Highly recommend this. This is a history of all of this that I just laid out there. This book is a history of all of it. It has some great excerpts from some other great thinkers and great writers at that time. It's just an incredible book, and it came out more recently too. I believe this was originally something that was scrapped by Rothbard. He wasn't going to publish it, and I believe it might have been Tom Woods who wrote the introduction to this, who's just an incredible libertarian historian, thinker. Tom Woods wrote the introduction to this, and I believe he found it and was like, why wasn't this published? Because it's so incredible. And he was the one who got the Mises Institute to publish this book, and it's just phenomenal. Highly, highly recommend for anyone interested in the history of the right-wing movement here in the United States. But that is where I will end it off today. Just a reminder, the four books I recommended: The Revolution by Ron Paul. I have A Republic, Not an Empire by Pat Buchanan, Domestic Imperialism by Keith Knight, and The Betrayal of the American Right by Murray Rothbard. Highly recommend all of these. And there, of course, if you zoom in behind me, there are plenty of other books here on the shelves that I also highly recommend. And that is where we'll end it off for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please be sure to go down below, hit like and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next episode. Have a good day.
It is about who we are. It is about what we believe.
They're building up this case just like we did in Iraq. Build up the war propaganda. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq.
The more you tell the truth, the stronger you become.
Mr. Speaker, we're not rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic tonight. We're putting coal in the boiler and setting a course for the iceberg.